It's a bit confusing, yeah. Well, welcome everyone. The topic of this, or the title rather I should say, of this panel is, in capital letters, The Day After. What next for the rules-based order? I got to say, The Day After, capitalised, has a mildly post-apocalyptic ring to it. It sort of brings to mind some of those late 90s movies where enormous tsunamis swamp US megacities. But hopefully that isn't an omen either for this discussion or for the next few weeks. Obviously, the subject for this discussion is not just the US election, but what a second Trump administration might look like for the region, what a Harris administration might look like for the region. Not only the bilateral relationship between the next incoming US administration with both India and Australia, but also how the region might respond to shifts in the US and the way that it might work together, whether that's through groups like the Quad or through other groupings, to try and secure its prosperity and its security in an increasingly fractured and uncertain world. And fortunately, we have a panel which is superbly well equipped to answer all of these questions. I'll go straight through it. First of all, of course, to my right, we have Marise Payne, Australia's former Foreign Minister and first female Defence Minister as well. This means, as her biography states, that she spent, quote, 7 years as a member of the National Security Committee of the Australian Cabinet in the most challenging and complex strategic environment of recent decades. I think that holds true, perhaps even compared to today, though some might argue, and this will, of course, give her some unique insights into what's happening at the moment and what might happen in the coming years. On top of that, we've got, of course, Samir Saran, the president of our ORF. You've heard from him so much so far, I'm not going to introduce him again. He needs no introduction, but Samir, you've once been described to me as perhaps the most candid person in New Delhi. I'm sure you'll bring that typically candid quality to this discussion. We really look forward to you answering questions instead of asking them. And finally, we've got, of course, Lisa Singh, former Australian senator, now the CEO of the Australia-India Institute, and since leaving Parliament, of course, Lisa has ploughed her considerable energies into trying to bolster the Australia-India bilateral relationship, and really looking forward to your insights as well. Now, obviously, this comes as results are just starting to flow into the US. If anyone sees anything decisive or interesting, Justin, I'm looking at you, please let me know. Send me a text or raise your hand, but I'm going to be blissfully ignorant otherwise. So let's start, perhaps, before we go to any sort of horse race question, to a really fraught question, which is, what's the fallout from this contest? And in particular, what I'm wondering is, what is the prospect, it's a horrible question to contemplate, but what is the prospect of real political violence in the US in the wake of this election? Obviously, everyone in this room would desperately hope that it is calm, but I might perhaps start with you if that's all right, Maurice. Are you anxious about this prospect? Do you believe there is a realistic prospect of serious unrest, perhaps particularly if Harris is successful by a narrow margin? Or are you a little bit more optimistic? And do you believe that the fever might be able to break in the US?
Well, I'm not sure that speculation actually necessarily helps, Stephen, but I was in DC just 2 weeks ago with Hoover Institution doing some work there. And I found DC to be, and it is Washington DC, right? So It is a microcosm, a bit like Canberra, only much larger. Found it to be tense and slightly fraught, both at the officials level and amongst political friends, but certainly with a readiness, given the experience of January 6th, after the last election, with a readiness to make sure that everything was put in place to avoid anything like that. Nobody wants to see that anywhere. We spend our lives as proponents of democracy and freedom trying to avoid those outcomes in relation to any political process. So, of course, that is a very confronting and challenging proposition. And I hope that our friends in the United States are similarly minded in terms of making every effort to avoid such an outcome.
Samir, what do you think? What's your assessment of the state of US democracy right now? Do you believe it is eroding, or are you confident that it's still got that wonderful capacity, that regenerative capacity to rebound that we've seen in the past? And what's your assessment of how things may play out over coming weeks?
Look, I love this question. Normally, it would be an American who would be asked to comment on India's democracy.
Yeah. Well, we can come
I
to
just
that.
love this question. And can you repeat it? I didn't hear it. Look, we should be worried, not just because of the potential violence or a refusal to accept the outcomes from either of the candidates, by the way. I think right now, I'm not sure that the belief that somehow the Democrats will accept a close verdict and will accept Donald Trump as their president should be taken for granted either. So I think it's fraught. And I agree with Minister Payne that it's, I think both parties are on the edge. Both segments of society are on the edge, and whoever wins will lose half of America.
Yeah.
Let's be very clear. And that's the American future. That the next president of America will lose half his country or her country from day one. And I think that's the tragic outcome of the process. However, I'm a firm believer that democracies heal themselves. And that is why this process is so sacrosanct to so many of us. We believe in democracy because we know how to heal ourselves. And I think we may be going through a terrible decade, but I believe in America's, and by the way, any robust democracy's capacities to come up with frameworks that respond to the shortcomings and the deficiencies that have surfaced. So I'm a believer in democracy. I'm a believer in America, certainly. I think its demise and its regression is overly exaggerated in many circles. It's fashionable to talk about the decline of America. It's not true. But I think we are in a crazy season right now in that particular part of the world, and we should be all, as friends of the country, be supporting a peaceful transition, a wholesome transition, and hopefully nudging them that perhaps many of the institutions that have been conducting forensics on democracies around the world should now be conducting forensics on their own democracy. So, the State Department, instead of spending money trying to fix other democracies around the world, should perhaps strengthen their own systems, because clearly something ain't working. And if you see the candidates over the last 3 or 4 cycles, tells you that we are not seeing leadership of the kind we expect from America, even in the pipeline. So in many ways, it's not just the refusal to accept outcomes. It is also a pipeline that is not producing visionaries that the sole superpower of the world must be able to churn out regularly.
Yeah.
So it is, opposition leaders having court cases against them, police cases against them, media declaring allegiance to one political party or another. This happens in the erstwhile third world. This doesn't happen in that part of the world, right? So it is a poor shadow of what it used to be, and I think we should support it at this stage.
Let's go, just because we've got an awful lot of ground to cover, let's talk about the 2 possible outcomes. I might come to you again on this, Samir, before going to Lisa after this. Let's say it's Harris. What does the Harris administration's policy in the Indo-Pacific look like? There are remarkably few clues out there, right, at the moment. We still don't really have a sense of exactly who should appoint necessarily to those key advisor positions, although there are a few names circulating. But starting with you, Samir, and then perhaps Lisa, do you get a sense that we'll be looking largely at, broadly speaking, continuity from the Biden administration? Will there be perhaps a bit less of a focus on our immediate region? Some people have speculated that Harris is likely to be more preoccupied with the Middle East and Europe than perhaps Biden was. What's your assessment early out?
Look, you would bet on continuity, a degree of continuity. That would be a comfortable bet to make. However, I think we also have to see a broader trend that is now at play in the US. And a friend of mine described it very cleverly as not isolationism, but insulationism. American security and foreign policy community has been very cleverly building partnerships around the world, including with India, for example, or the Quad, the plurilateral groupings, which will allow American recalcitrants in terms of their engagement to be managed through a grouping of partners who will carry the slack, even as America gets preoccupied with itself. So I think there will be continuity. There will certainly be less exuberance than the Biden administration. It will continue to decline. However, I think they will work through these quasi-alliances and partnerships, and of course, the former treaty partners like Australia, to pick up the slack. Harris will be continuity, but by the way, Trump will be the same. So I don't think Trump is going to be any different. It's just he's going to be more fun in his tweets. But as far as the region is concerned, I don't think there is too much of a divergence between the Biden policy and...
You don't think people in Seoul and Tokyo, for example, might have a different view on that?
I'm sure they do, but you look, if they understood the English language like I do, it is fun. Trump is fun, right? He's entertainment, right? Foreign policy is a dark space today.
Yeah.
It's a really grey, dark space. Trump is light.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not a voter, and I'm not endorsing Trump, so don't get me.
Yeah.
I think both will have very similar approaches.
Trump is fun. Yeah. Lisa, what's your assessment of? I know it's a very difficult question, but do you think just more continuity than change if it is Harris? And do you agree with Samir? Trump is really nothing more than a slightly fun version of Harris. I got to say that is a novel argument that I haven't encountered yet.
Well, it'd be very novel if I agree with Samir as well. I think.
Yeah.
But look, I think the answer to that question is what does Australia want out of that? Versus what is going to be the reality of it. So, of course, Australia wants a continued US presidency that is stabilising in our region. I think we get that under Harris. I think with Trump, there is a lot of unpredictability. We know that his sort of modus operandi is unilaterally focused rather than multilaterally. Therefore, a lot of the sort of groupings that exist currently that Australia engages with in this region with the US, are potentially up for change under a Trump presidency. And I think only, a Harris presidency continues that Biden administration, stable presence in our region. And things like, when we think of the Pacific, IPEF, for example, Fiji is at the table there. Now, if IPEF doesn't exist under Trump, then that is a huge concern for the Pacific Island nations and for, the growing economic potential of our region.
Maurice, I might come to you now. You've obviously dealt, as everyone would know, with senior members of the former Trump administration. Are there any observations you'd offer about life under Trump 2.0 and the best way for Australia to potentially deal with the second Trump administration? What do you think of Malcolm Turnbull's advice about standing up to a bully, for example?
I'm pan-administration, that's how I describe myself. I started in the Obama administration, transitioned to the Trump administration, and then to the Biden administration. And I think in relation to continuity, I tend to agree with Samir on that. We shouldn't forget that the Biden administration in recent years has, of course, launched their Indo-Pacific strategy. They have signed the defence arrangement with Papua New Guinea. They have increased their defence participation with the Philippines. Vice President Harris herself chaired, I think, or convened the US-Japan-Philippine trilateral summit. So they are I refreshed my memory for today's conversation, and I think that it's important not to forget those aspects of the Biden administration's work, particularly given the heavy lifting that they have been doing in other parts of the world, whether that be the Middle East or the Ukraine context. So I think, Stephen, that personnel, no matter who is elected this week, personnel will matter extraordinarily. And you said that there are names out there, and that's true. There are on both sides ideas being thrown around. On the Trump side, some of those are already familiar to Australia. On the Harris side, there's less familiarity, but they are sound propositions, and they will be very important people. And we have found that through both the first Trump administration and, frankly, into the Biden administration. One of the reasons why the personnel have been so important for our relationships in the Biden administration is because the President has been doing so much of the heavy lifting, the Secretary of State particularly, in terms of the current conflicts that they are dealing with in the Middle East and in Ukraine. In the Trump administration, I dealt with 2 Secretaries of State, 2 Secretaries of Defence, and I think in total 3 or 4 national security advisors.
A lot of churn.
So we know that it is important. So yes, there was churn, but the Australia-US relationship was able to continue due to the hard work, frankly, on both sides, and I'm not talking about myself, I'm just saying in broad terms, on both sides, from officials and from individuals who held those key roles. We must be head down, tail up on that again as soon as there is an outcome on either side. I remember in 2016, great advice from my then Secretary in the Department of Defence, Dennis Richardson. In about October, he said, Maurice, probably said minister because he was very formal, we are going to Washington, DC. We are going to walk both sides of the aisle. You can't have a better tour guide than the former ambassador to the United States for Australia and departmental head. We did that. I made contacts and connections in 2016 that literally continue to this day on both the Democrat and the Republican side. It was an invaluable engagement. When we got to DC, Joe Hockey wasn't there. Dennis was a little, where's the ambassador? The Minister for Defence is here. Joe had taken himself off to Cleveland, to the Republican convention. He was the only diplomat in Washington, DC who had taken himself to Cleveland for the Republican convention. And then, because the rest of the tale is that the Republicans were elected, he had connections that many others didn't. Very interesting period.
Yeah, that is interesting. Just before I go to the India relationship, I'd like Lisa and Samir on both of these. What's your assessment about the fate of Orcus under Trump? Obviously, there have been some assurances that have been given from some people within his orbit. We've got seemingly a favourable assessment from Vance. Meetings that apparently Penny Wong had with Pompeo seem to be positive signals out of that. But, of course, Trump is notoriously fickle. Do you think there is a prospect of Trump tearing it up just because he's in the mood to do so? Or do you think that the institutional support and bipartisan congressional support for Orcus should be enough to carry it through?
I'm confident that Orcus would be taken seriously by a Trump administration and its officials. It's a trilateral arrangement that Australia is making a very significant financial contribution to as well. And that has been part of the dialogue in the past. We make a contribution to pay our way, as it were, in inverted commas, and were seen as a contributor in the 2016 to 2020 period by the Trump administration. That's really important. I think the engagement of the UK in Orcus is relevant as well. They would obviously be saying, I think, to any new administration in the United States, this is something to which we are wholly committed and we want to continue that. I would like to think that is where Sir Keir Starmer would take that as Prime Minister. As I understand it, the former President has also been briefed by former Prime Minister Morrison in relation to Orcus in terms of its inception. And that is, I think, also influential in terms of making sure that there's an understanding now. It's not something that we need to expect to be learnt about if that is the political outcome. So I'll then circle back to say the people will matter. Back to my first comments, the Secretary of Defence will matter, the Secretary of State will matter, the National Security Advisor will matter.
Samir, how does this look from New Delhi? Generally speaking, most analysts seem to believe that India is very happy to work with either Trump or Harris. What's your assessment? What's the mood in Delhi?
Look, I think that's right. I think we are less particular about who we need to deal with. I think that's a democratic outcome. And we will deal with whoever the people of the United States choose as their next president. And I think that's a fair basis to begin any relationship, that you will deal with the voice of the people. So for us, it doesn't really matter. And also, I think because Dr. Jaishankar said something very interesting yesterday. In his interaction with Justin, if I remember correctly, he explained very succinctly that our political culture is very different to the Australian. We never had to lean on America, never had an America to lean on. So we had to build our own strategic culture, our own security architecture. We had to create a room to maneuver, space to engage with many countries so as to secure our interests, right? So we didn't have a treaty partners like the US or anyone else who was so important to our thinking and our geopolitical culture that has emerged. So we are largely independent, autonomous, free agents. We know what we seek as a country. We know who are those who can help us achieve those, and we will partner with exactly those actors, right? So Australia and India have made these dramatic and transformational leaps to their bilateral relationship simply because both of us have reached the conclusion, domestic conclusion, that our partnership is useful for each other, right? So we see the US relationship no differently. For us, we have to work with the US irrespective of who's in the White House, because we have 4 or 5 areas of convergence where we would complement and benefit from that relationship. So, yes, Trump may be, more melodramatic, but in India we have Bollywood, right? We like melodrama. So it's not a bad thing being melodramatic, right? So I mean,
Fabulous metaphor.
so the point here is that yes, there are different strokes, different folks, and we need to deal with them. And you're right.
Thanks, Samir. Lisa, let's talk a little bit about the Quad. Obviously, the Quad prospered under Trump 1.0. I think Dr. Jaishankar mentioned this yesterday in either the press conference or his remarks when he was asked, would Trump tear up the Quad? And he said, well, no, probably not, given it was elevated again under the Trump administration. The first in-person meeting. And then some meetings as well during COVID when almost no other you correct me if I'm wrong, there were very few face-to-face meetings.
They were hard to do, but we did them.
Yeah, I can only imagine. But Lisa, what's your assessment? Do you think that groups like the Quad, even as perhaps traditional alliance relationships like the US-Korea relationship, the US-Japan relationship become under strain, become more transactional, that small groups like the Quad could prosper again under Trump 2.0?
Yeah, I think you will see a continuation, whether it's under Trump 2.0 or Harris, of the Quad continuing to stay and be that real anchor of, I think, as Jaishankar calls it, public goods delivery in our region. But it's more the makeup of those public goods. As we know, the Quad has become quite broad in its delivery of various, policy focus areas and working groups. If there's one I could pick out of its current work agenda that could be under threat under Trump 2.0, it's climate change.
Yeah.
We know that, Trump has called climate change a scam. So in terms of the Quad's work agenda, I think that could change under Trump 2.0. But as you say, it got strengthened under Trump. Biden has gone further with that, with the Leaders Summit. So that is a good thing. I think, though, overall, picking up on what Samir said about the India-US relationship under Trump, I think under either Trump or Harris, India's ambivalent. US, however, really sees India as pivotal to its ongoing counterbalance to China. So I think whether it's Harris or Trump, India will continue to be in the purview of the US as needing to be a really strong relationship. Similarly for Australia, we have that ongoing, very old alliance with the US that I cannot see ever changing under Trump or Harris. So there's some real anchors there for both Australia and India, and of course both of us playing out therefore through the Quad. So that may make the Australia-India relationship even more crucial in terms of the work agenda that is delivered through the Quad if Trump 2.0 is a reality and, he continues to push away from the climate change agenda as he did under his last presidency, ripping up, the Paris Agreement and pulling out of various other multilateral activities. And that has real implications for the Pacific. We had a panel here yesterday with 2 leaders from Tonga and Fiji that made it very clear that this is the existential threat of this region and for them in their lifetime, in their current lifetime, not even their grandparents, their grandchildren. So, that is a real concern, and I think something where Japan and Australia and India need to really step up in a leadership sense if Trump does become elected.
Yeah, I just might press on that because it's a good question. Trump's attitudes on climate change and his actions are very well known. There are 2 schools of thought. Some say, some climate analysts say that if Trump wins, then it's, I think as one said, that's game over for for serious global action on climate change. Others disagree. They think the sheer weight of capital now behind the green transition, as well as the fact that there's strong support throughout parts of Congress for the Inflation Reduction Act and all of means that Trump might dent climate action but won't seriously derail it. I know none of you are sort of specialists in this field, but any reflections on which of those views might hold true?
To use your words, Stephen, the sheer impetus that is underway, I think, is difficult to stop and should not be stopped, don't get me wrong. And so the weight that is behind that from other global leaders, India, the UK, Japan, South Korea, Australia in this government, that is essential for that. I think I have a personal observation to make about the effectiveness of the United Nations currently on these issues. I think that there is a lack of outcomes, if I may say politely, there, but hopefully the drive that is embedded in our nations, particularly in this region, and of course across Africa. Kamala Harris has had an interest in Africa in the past. Of course, across Africa and Europe will continue strongly.
Stephen, I was very quickly on this point.
Yeah.
I think we exaggerate Trump's impact on climate action, and we give a free pass to Biden administration on climate action. The reality is, what the gentlemen yesterday evening were saying to all of us is that the crucial finance that they require for saving their islands and for protecting their current existence has not been delivered to them. Less than 3% of global climate finance has gone to the developing world if you remove China from it.
Yeah.
Right? Less than 3%. 92% of all private investments in climate remain in the home country, which basically means if 2/3 of future emissions are going to come from the emerging and developing countries, those emissions are not likely to be green unless green finance moves there. It's simple maths. If 2/3 of emissions have to be abated, 2/3 of climate finance needs to be deployed to the emerging and developing countries. So if half of future climate disasters are going to occur in the islands and in the weak and vulnerable countries, adaptation needs to be on steroids. Adaptation funds, climate change is not a future challenge, it is a current challenge. And if we believe in the science, unlike Trump, then climate adaptation fund has to be much bigger because that science is now playing out in real time, right? And any administration that ignores adaptation has been given a free pass if they've not been castigated for it.
Yeah, problems.
And Biden administration has been guilty of presiding over 4 years of minimal advancement of climate finance when it comes to the developing, vulnerable and emerging economies.
Structural problems, of course, too, in some of those multilateral institutions, which Maurice, but sorry, Lisa, you wanted to make a
Well, I
point.
think that the irony here is that Samir is right. There's been too much focus domestically, say in the US, for example, being such a high emitter and, part of the cause of why the poor Pacific Island nations are facing this existential crisis. The irony here is that, you have a billionaire in the United States, in Elon Musk, who recognises that, can't continue to rely on fossil fuels and created, one of the best EV vehicles,
Supporting Trump.
Is supporting Trump, who clearly doesn't follow that same agenda. But I think that domestic focus needs to shift away into a more global response, which is exactly what the Quad is about in our particular region and why we need to ensure that its work agenda.
By the way, I think with Trump, climate change is a semantics issue. It is not a real issue. As long as there's money to be made, he will support it. You have to move from climate change into energy transitions. And suddenly he starts thinking economics. So it's a semantics
Well, the
issue.
economics have been playing through Republican states as well, right?
Correct.
People
Like Elon Musk,
All right.
for example.
We've only got a short amount of time. And Justin, are there any updates at all that I should be aware of? Sorry, I don't know why I'm coming to you. What's happening in Indiana, for the love of God? Can you tell? Yeah, Florida with Trump. Yep, no surprises there. All right, no breaking news yet, but Justin will jump in if there is. He's my new breaking news reporter.
I think he's got James doing it.
Look, quickly, because we are running out of time, one issue I wanted to touch on, not directly connected to the Quad, but which does connect to the relationship between India and the rest, is this extraordinary diplomatic confrontation that we've seen recently between India and Canada. I won't go over the entrail or pick through the entrails of it. I think everyone in this room knows what Canada has accused India of and the response we've seen from India. I might ask all panellists, starting with Maurice on this and moving to Samir and Lisa, do you think this episode, is it safe to assume that Western countries, particularly Canada and the US, but perhaps with the backing of Australia, are trying to draw some red lines here when it comes to Indian behaviour? And do you think that this episode does seriously risk eroding strategic trust between countries in the West that are perhaps part of the Five Eyes, for example, between those countries and India? Or do you think in the end they view this primarily as a dispute between India and Canada and that its impact on those broader relationships will be marginal?
I don't think it serves a great purpose for an Australian former recovering, I call myself, politician, to comment on those issues between Canada and India. They are a manifestation of aspects of that relationship. But to be fair, Stephen, globally, there are often extraordinarily sensitive bilateral issues between countries on which we could all take a view and have our 10 cents worth. And I don't actually think that adds to the great weight of consideration. When I was dealing, for example, with very sensitive issues with Iran, more broadly than the observation about arbitrary detention, which we participated in with a number of other key countries around the world, I wasn't really looking for everybody else's view on the Australia-Iran relationship to help me along. I was really working on the principle. And yes, I think you can work from the principle, but ad hoc comments, it's not really my style.
Well, Samir, do you have any ad hoc comments that you'd like to make?
Ad hoc comments is my style.
Yeah.
So let me make some.
It's great to be on a board with, by the
Yes,
way.
I can
My
imagine.
ORF America board.
So look, I will take inspiration from the great Australian statesman, and I know all of you will disagree, Malcolm Turnbull. But look, I think there is a personnel problem here. Marise mentioned that personnel are important, and I agree with her. The problem is not an India-Canada problem. The problem is that there is a little boy as prime minister who's running a country that requires now a real leader. It's a personnel problem. And Malcolm Turnbull, which you actually, by the way, thank you for
I shouldn't have told you this
You shouldn't have told me that.
Oh.
But I quickly Googled and found that very interesting paragraph, and he asked a serious question to the great Prime Minister of Canada, and the response was, how do you like the color of my socks? And I think that is precisely where our relationship is. That when we were having serious conversations, the Prime Minister of Canada was doing a beauty parade in India 6 years ago. When this issue should have been nipped in the bud, he was more worried about his attire every second hour of the day that he was changing than discussing serious critical questions. Now, let's come to the core issue here. You're right that these matters have implications. But I would just argue that around the same time, you have a similar conversation underway between the US and India. You have leaders on both sides having some discussions, which I'm not privy to and we don't really know. But based on newspaper reports, there is an exchange that is taking place between the US, security community, foreign ministries, etc.
This is on the Payne matter, to be clear.
Sorry?
On the Payne matter.
Correct. So there is a conversation that is underway. There are processes underway. There is cooperation underway. And adults are having that conversation. On the other hand, you have this preposterous Canadian accusation, which the Prime Minister himself admits in Parliament really has no evidence to back it, and yet it has been blown up into international circus. And I think, A, friends don't discuss things in this manner, and I think there is a problem here. And B, that country needs a leader.
Well, preposterous is what, I mean...
Look, the reason I'm saying preposterous is because...
Not because it is necessarily factually untrue.
Because it is not factually true. Because for it to be, I'm not saying it is untrue, but for it to be factually true, there needs to be a submission of some facts. And those are missing. Evidence points in he says all evidence points in a direction. Have they yet submitted anything that the government of India has asked them for? And he has himself admitted in Parliament that he doesn't have any proof, but fingers point in that direction. Well, the point I'm trying to make is, I don't want to make this about Canada. God bless them. But listen, they have imported criminality. They have imported a vestigial struggle from some place which does not exist in the original country. If they want to own that struggle and make it theirs, God bless them. They can import and by the way, I think I found it in some sense also ironic that a country that is now engaging and in many ways has its politics embedded into struggles and petty identity politics that have been imported from other parts of the world. And by the way, it's not only from India. They have these small cohorts that define the future of their elections from different parts of the world, and they play petty politics with each one of them. That is not a Western power. It is a third world power. You know, where they have to suspend a cop because he was promoting violence against a particular group just a couple of days ago. That doesn't happen in a developed country, where you have criminality in the police force, where the petty politicians are involved in trafficking. I think let's be very clear here that yes, there is you guys all have a certain historic relationship with them, and you will obviously feel a little bit of affinity to them. But when you have a rational conversation, their behavior does not merit that kind of empathy.
We're rapidly running out of time. So Lisa, on this incredibly non-sensitive and uncontroversial subject, why don't I bring you in now?
Well,
do you have any, and I'll try and bring it back to Australia. Obviously, the issues that have sprung up between India and Canada when it comes to Khalistan do exist in Australia, although the magnitude of the problem is far, far, far smaller. But, I mean, do you think that this can be deftly managed by both sides when it comes to the Australia-India relationship, or does it pose a threat over time of perhaps undermining that bilateral relationship as it has in Canada?
It reminds me of those Berenstain Bear books. I don't know if anyone used to read them, but it's what not to do when you look at Canada and India at the moment. I mean, I think it's really tragic because at a time when there is so much geopolitical competition, uncertainty, changing nature of our own region and beyond, to have a relationship like that go completely to the ground is not useful for any of us, let alone the two countries in question. So I think we can sit back here in Australia and feel quite happy with ourselves that we do have such a strong and robust and growing relationship with India, and that sort of playbook is not something that we would ever want to go down. That said, we do have some similarities in terms of, as you touched on, some tensions within our own diaspora. And, I think our foreign minister has made it very clear that, this is a country where you have the right to peacefully protest, but when it becomes violent, then that is not the values and the sorts of activities that we stand for in this country. And there has been a little bit of that, and I would hope that that doesn't continue. We really do need to ensure that voices can be heard where there's differences, but that it's done peacefully, and that our diaspora, as diverse as it is when it comes to our Indian diaspora, can at least feel that this is a country that they can feel peacefully engaging in a way that is not going to play out the way it has in Canada.
All right. I've gone on too long. I've left not enough time for questions. Apologies all, but we probably have time for at least one or two if I've got the nod from up high. Good, thanks. Does anyone have any questions for either or any of our panellists?
Looks like we're going to get off lightly.
We're going to get off lightly? Everyone wants lunch.
Well, I think
David is there, I can see.
I was going to say one thing.
Oh, yeah, do you want to say before the question?
No.
Thanks, Stephen. I thought we had to have at least one question for such a compelling panel, so thank you all for your frankness and your remarks. But if I may say, I felt you were all rather sanguine on the prospects of a second Trump administration and the consequences that would have for both America and the world. So, Maurice, as you said, that a lot of the crucial positions are actually below the president. It's the secretaries, it's the national security advisor, and so on. Now, while we may say, perhaps somewhat cheekily, that Trump is melodramatic and fun, I'm not sure I'd apply that language to many of the people that are being suggested will be his secretaries of state and defense and national security advisor and so on. So, what do we think are the consequences of these potential appointments as, you might say, independent power centres within a second Trump administration, and their consequences for policy making and how it might affect Australia and the Indo-Pacific?
Maurice?
So I'm not sure that sanguine is the word that I would use. You have to be realistic. You have to take what comes your way, as both Samir and Lisa have said. In the democratic process, we deal with our partners and allies around the world and whoever is served up to us as their new government. But I don't see any value in running around with our hair on fire at the same time in that context. That's no way to treat these very deeply serious relationships. So the point that I was trying to make is that from Australia's perspective, in the last Trump administration, I think we came out of that process perhaps in reasonable shape, better shape than many of our global partners and allies. We worked very, very, very hard at it as well. It was a great honour to work in the strong development of the Quad at the time, with the support of Secretary Pompeo, for example, to make sure that those Indo-Pacific relationships, which both for me, Secretary Mattis and then Secretary Pompeo were strong advocates for, strong proponents of, were core to what we were doing. So I have confidence in the systems, confidence in the officials, and although there will be significant change if there is a change of administration, I think the number is estimated at about 3,000 people across the system, not obviously just in foreign policy or national security. I do have confidence in the systems, and I have confidence in, from my part, the Australia-US alliance in particular. The last thing I wanted to say was to basically acknowledge both ORF and ASPI in terms of the work that they have done to bring this together. To be able to have this constructive conversation, to be able to have this discussion is a hallmark of the work that they both do as think tanks, and I really appreciate being invited to attend.
Thanks for that. And with that, there's a big red screen in front of me saying time's up. So I'm afraid time is up. Thank you very much. Can you all please thank our esteemed panellists?
Thank you. Thank you, friends.
Thank you.
And now I assume it's time for lunch, but Justin, I think, will come to the podium.
You might have some results.
And thank you for sending the results. The results are bewildering. There's 32% of Ohio counted, and Harris is in front, but I don't know what the counties are.
It's all very close.
Okay.
It's all very close. And I'm sure all the postals, there were